Hello, welcome to this week's sermon. This sermon is for the 24th of March 2024. That will be Palm Sunday, Year B. The readings are Isaiah chapter 50, verses 4 to 9a, and John's Gospel chapter 12, verses 12 to 16. In today's passage from Isaiah 50, the prophet speaks for a third time out of a total of four about a servant. Or should that be about servanthood? Sometimes a servant appears to be Israel as a nation, but on other occasions, such as here, the servant appears to be an individual. In both instances, Isaiah depicts the servant as having to suffer for the sake of fulfilling his commission. The Lord has given the servant the message he must deliver. In my translation, that reads, "The Lord has given me an instructed tongue." To be called by God is not something that can be shrugged off when new interests come along or when difficulties arise. The call to faithfulness is morning by morning. The servant must remain loyal even through the most brutal persecution and humiliation. He offers his back to those who beat him. He doesn't hide his face from those who would pull out his beard and spit at him. It is difficult to read such verses on Palm Sunday without having Jesus in the forefront of our minds. It is no wonder the evangelists saw such a strong foreshadowing of Christ's suffering in such a passage. The servant does not run away, nor fight back, but accepts the pain in the belief that God will ultimately vindicate him, that his suffering will not be in vain. Serving Christ has always required a certain amount of sacrifice and potential suffering. For many Christians in the early centuries, and many Christians today in hostile countries, sacrifice and suffering may demand the ultimate sacrifice. For many, it means at least social exclusion from the best jobs or political office. I met many Methodists from the old East Germany who had lost out in jobs, opportunities, and status for the sake of their faith. For people like us today, our sacrifice is little more than the inconvenience of attending church on Sunday for a couple of hours. For a few of us, it means taking on responsibilities for money and property and sitting through a multitude of meetings. But few of us will pay a higher price than that. Yet I sense that it is becoming harder to find people willing to make even those sacrifices. Perhaps it is the rise of consumerism and the idea that we come to church for what we can get out of it and think far less about what we can give. Modern consumerism was famously challenged by the late J.F. Kennedy. Don't ask what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. That's the only approach that ensures the survival of the church. Why might we be less willing to make such sacrifices? Perhaps because we have so much else in life, so many alternatives for our time, energy, and money. Or is it because we believe our sacrifice will be in vain? The church has been on the slide for so long, we have lost the will to make great sacrifices because we think it will be to no avail. This is what happened towards the end of World War II among the German forces. As defeat loomed, fewer soldiers were prepared to die for the Führer and fatherland. Many gave up and surrendered. having fought tenaciously in the earlier part of the war. When sacrifice seems like a futile gesture, why do it? Easter is vital for our Christian morale. It is the victory of the resurrection alone that inspires us to make the sacrifices necessary for the gospel. If we stay in Good Friday, we are a beaten army. Only by embracing Easter do we find hope. In John's brief account of Palm Sunday, we see Jesus heading towards such suffering, accepting it as part of his vocation to serve God. We call it Palm Sunday, but only John's Gospel actually mentions palms. The other Gospel writers refer to branches they had cut. Luke doesn't even mention branches, but only the cloaks they placed on the road in front of Jesus. Palms were used to greet Judas Maccabeus about 150 years earlier, when he returned in triumph to rededicate the temple in Jerusalem after defeating the Syrians. That's 2 Maccabees 10 verse 7. After centuries of foreign oppression, Maccabeus had led them to freedom. Another instance of palms used as symbols of national celebration and military victory is when they were briefly used on the coins of the later Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome in 132 to 135 AD. Putting down cloaks on the road to be walked over was a sign of pledging loyalty to a new king. In 2 Kings chapter 9, verses 11 to 13, the army commanders lay their garments in front of Jehu, who has just been proclaimed king. The greeting shouted by the crowd on Palm Sunday is a quotation from Psalm 118, verses 25 and 26. This psalm and these verses were used usually at the Feast of Tabernacles rather than the Passover. But again, they are significant today in this context because the crowds had greeted the conquering Judas Maccabeus with these words 150 years earlier. Clearly, they were welcoming Jesus as their warrior Messiah. It is true that Jesus had deliberately chosen to enter the city that day over the Mount of Olives, riding a donkey, as a deliberate act to fulfill the messianic prophecy of Zechariah 9, verse 9. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So Jesus wasn't denying he was the Messiah. It is just that he was not the sort of Messiah they thought they were greeting. Donkeys may be seen in many Western countries as somewhat ridiculous animals, best suited to children visiting the beach. But in ancient times, they were treasured beasts of burden and wealth, and were used to signify a king or army commander approached in peace rather than in battle. In 2 Samuel 19, verse 26, the royal prince Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan and grandson of King Saul, was unsure of his safety when approaching King David. Would David see him as a rival because of his royal ancestry? To display his peaceful intentions, Mephibosheth contemplates approaching David riding on a donkey. It may be easy for us to see how blind the crowd was in failing to interpret Jesus' intentions. It is clear to us now that Jesus had no intention of playing the role they had envisaged for him. He was not going to be their warrior king in the mould of Judas Maccabeus. How could they have ever supposed otherwise? Yet the danger of misrepresenting Jesus did not stop with the crowds of Holy Week. We are all prone to laying upon Jesus the expectations of our own cultural, political, or denominational bias. It is a common error in my neck of the woods to talk of Jesus as if he was an Englishman or a founding member of the Labour Party. Allowing Jesus to be Jesus has always been a supreme challenge. People demand of Jesus things that he has never promised and has no intention of giving. Some people lose faith because Jesus did not give them what they thought he would. But how well did they truly know Jesus? Were their dreams ever more than wild and misplaced fancies? Jesus never promised you worldly wealth or success. Neither did he promise to keep you free of illness. What he does promise is further strife and tribulation on his behalf, and the promise to stand by you to the end, to share that with you, but not to make it disappear. One lesson we can heed from Palm Sunday is to look at Jesus, but look carefully, closely. Know him as he is, not as you imagine him to be. Close study of the scriptures and the wisdom of the great scholars of the church are there to guide you. Do not become like the Pharisees, blind guides. If a blind man leads a blind man, both will fall into a pit. I'm not sure how closely the crowd was looking at Jesus on Palm Sunday. As I say, they were welcoming Jesus in the same way as Judas Maccabeus had been welcomed. Jesus was no leader of a revolutionary army in the conventional sense. It is likely that many who welcomed him on Palm Sunday cried for his crucifixion on Good Friday because they were disappointed that Jesus was not the military leader they had hoped. Only, this is not the sole reason they abandoned him. Peter, for example, denied knowing Jesus during the trial. Peter was Jesus' right-hand man, but even he abandoned Jesus. His denial was not out of loss of faith, but out of fear. We must guard against the fear of the crowd. In an age when religious faith is an ever smaller part of our society, it is easy to be intimidated by the sheer numbers of your friends, relatives and colleagues, and the general background noise of our culture, and come to believe that you are alone, peculiar, an oddity because of your faith. It is natural for us to want to fit in, to be accepted by the crowd. Humans are designed to live together in family and tribal groups. The desire to fit in is the foundation of building consensus and establishing society. But to follow Christ demands the courage to not follow the crowd. And that is by no means an easy choice. When Jesus entered Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, he was surrounded by his adoring supporters, his disciples and their entourage. These, like Peter, had been firm followers for years, but would have to face the threat of a hostile crowd within a few days. They faced the same dilemma as Peter. Others, however, who cheered Jesus and laid their coats on the ground before him, were not close disciples. Many were from the crowd of pilgrims making their way towards the holy city for Passover. A contemporary historian, Josephus, claims as many as 2 million attended Passover from throughout the ancient world. For many, it was the exciting highlight of a once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage. They were already in a highly emotional state. Imagine, on this day of all days, the day when they made their rare, perhaps only visit to Jerusalem, They happened upon the arrival of the Messiah. What excitement! How wonderful! I imagine they would have very quickly cheered Jesus and acclaimed him Messiah without knowing much about him at all. It was superficial. It was a passing fancy. They were caught up in the crowd. Jesus told a parable about seed sown in a field and how most of that seed fell on unproductive soil, on the path, on the stones, among the thistles. Most of the seed was lost. It either failed to take root or was gobbled up immediately. This is a warning especially to younger members in church today. Do not just follow the crowd. Whether or not you join us in church and dedicate your life to following Christ is one of, if not the most important decisions of your life. A lot is at stake, even if we are mistaken about Jesus. If we are not mistaken, then everything is at stake. Think carefully before you commit. Take Jesus seriously, even if you walk away. And don't walk away before giving it very, very careful thought. Your decision might just determine more than just the rest of your life. It will undoubtedly affect more than just yourself. Amen.